for that. And thanks to all the organizers of this day, where I have discovered that people at this university are smart and friendly. What a great bunch of people. What a good day. And thanks especially to June for spearheading the invitation. Yeah,
Thank you,
June. Okay, so this paper was written to answer the question, why are people, especially teenagers, reading dystopian novels? Is there something about our era, and particularly our era as it's understood by their generation, that makes these books appealing? I've come up with an answer to that question, but there might be other answers. I am not of that generation, right? So for me, sort of the generation that I'm speaking from begins in around the 1960s and extends for 64 years, 65 years. So I mean I'm not 65, but that's my philosophical area. So if you have other answers to the appeal of these books, I wouldn't mind if you could tell me after the paper. In any case, I begin the talk with a paragraph on dystopian books generally, and then move to the Hunger Games as my test case. A lot has been said about why Western children and teenagers are enjoying dystopian novels these days. Most of it, I think, more or less correct. Teenagers, people point out, have probably always had an ambivalent relation to power. They are and aren't ready for it, they want it and don't want it, and they're starting to have it, while at the same time to experience its limits and its discontents. This persists, while at the same time we have a new situation by which increasingly we're all in a position where paranoia is prudent, where we feel ourselves manipulated by big data, government, surveillance, conspiracy, terrorism, take your pick. In short, we're all in a position where we feel a lack of power. The anxiety of the era then complicates the natural teenage anxiety and makes the process of growing into this supposedly natural power of adulthood fairly fraught, and dystopian novels present a way to think through this difficult and multiple position. To all this, commonly said, I would add that the teenage reliance on technology intensifies the anxiety, as reliance on technology means reliance on a class of experts over whom we have no control. This, of course, is everyone's problem. But Western teenagers, most of whom have a very strong relationship with their phones, and most of whom do not code, experience it more viscerally than adults, and I believe are more aware of it. That is, more aware of themselves as being caught into a system characterized by an exciting and dangerous blend of mastery and being mastered. The phone, for instance, provides mastery insofar as it provides access to information and other human beings, but masters us insofar as we only have access to what someone has decided we should have access to, and also because reliance on it decreases self-reliance, meaning we can't function without it. Video games are another case in point. We push buttons to control the shooter, but at the same time we're being led down mental paths that are highly delimited. And physically, of course, we're just being trained to push a set of buttons in a correct order. Again, I don't mean to suggest that teenagers don't understand this business of mastering and being mastered at the same time. They understand it better than I do. In my experience, they are, in fact, almost at home in the uneasiness or uncanniness of this dialectic, and they seek out ways to reflect on it and analyze it. So, a teenage ambivalence about power, a widespread sense of powerlessness, and a peculiar new dialectical power relation with technology, these are already, to my mind, a good set of reasons for picking up a dystopian novel, every dystopian novel being an exploration of attempts to grasp some kind of power in a situation in which power is grotesquely curtailed in terms that are much clearer than those of real life. Okay. But I would like to focus today on a different aspect of the genre. Nothing in what I've said so far provides a reason why a decent and reasonable person might object to these books. And some of these people do object. In fact, there's a sort of groundswell of objection confronting the darkness or hopelessness of recent YA. So, Ewan Morrison of The Guardian, writing about The Giver, Divergent, and The Hunger Games, tells us that there's something new in contemporary dystopia. What marks these dystopias out from previous ones is that almost without exception, the bad guys are not corporations, but those well-meaning leftist liberals who want to make the world a better place. Similarly, queer theorist Merritt Kopus tells us that The Hunger Games in particular and dystopia in general bore her. Dystopia as a genre often seems to lack any real future-oriented political imagination. Dystopias are reactionary projections that don't do anything for us in the here and now. In many ways, imagining dystopia is a safer activity than imagining utopia. The latter involves projecting our hopes, desires, and fantasies rather than simply our fears. And finally, a similar sentiment is sometimes expressed by children's literature scholars, though I would say the way they theorize it tends to be more reflective and sophisticated. Thus, for instance, Susan Louise Stewart, in a piece on The Giver, objects to the fact that the positive alternative the novel provides appears to be our own world, with its insistence on the centrality of the subject and the essential virtue of choice. She writes that the text ultimately returns readers to the ideals liberal humanism proposes without actually examining them, and does little to challenge some concepts that under close inspection are problematic. So these three objections merge into a single central lament. The contemporary dystopia does not offer a creative, future-oriented politics, an alternative politics, an ideal politics. It is all dystopia, no utopia. Now, I think it's basically true that these books tend to be politically dark and hopeless. They often present corruption and injustice as unavoidable, and they don't usually suggest, as is often the case in novels for younger readers, that a clear eye and a good heart can show us the way to set things right. But I applaud this. I see it as almost the whole basis for these books' appeal. In fact, in their lack of a utopian alternative, these books echo a major strand in late 20th century philosophy, which sees dystopia as the result of utopia. This strand emerges, as you might well know, from the insight that the totalitarian regimes of the middle of the 20th century were utopian, and that it was their visions of political perfection that drove them to perpetrate mass death. The Nazis, for instance, cannot be understood if one thinks of them as nihilists bent on destruction. The true and truly chilling nature of their endeavor can only be grasped if one understands that they were trying to create a paradise on earth. And of course, you cannot have deformations of humanity like Jews, gypsies, and gays in a paradise. I will not make the argument at length. It is familiar. It obviously applies to Lenin, Mao, Pol Pot, and others even more than the Nazis. Less obviously, but still famously, it applies to our own society's capitalistically infused convictions about global moral progress, which some would argue have also caused much suffering. Of course, I've given here only a single broad stroke. In practice, people and regimes have many motives. Nevertheless, the anti-utopian idea, the idea that the desire for global perfection will inevitably create dystopia, is a strong one. And when it emerges in texts directed to children and teens, it tends to be well received. One of the questions I'm investigating is the extent to which the idea shows up in cultural production, particularly games produced in Japan. It is certainly the dominant story of the Pokemon games. In each of the 15 or so versions of which the villains, from Giovanni of the early games through Archie and Maxie of the latest version, are attempting not to destroy the world, but to save it or perfect it or redeem it, an endeavor that requires violence on a massive scale. In Western children's novels, it's found most dominantly, of course, in The Giver, where the community's whole purpose is to rid themselves of hatred and violence, something they have, by the beginning of the novel, found they can only do by enslaving, brainwashing, and occasionally murdering the population. And this utopian dystopian thrust is also there in The Hunger Games. For when, at the end of the third book, and by the way, there are 4 potential spoilers that I could give you about the end of The Hunger Games, for those of you who are like relying on the movies and haven't read the books. And I'm only going to give you one. So I'm not going to tell you who Katniss gets with. When at the end of the third book, the new regime becomes the old regime, there's your spoiler, when District 13 is revealed as a potential new capital, it is at least arguably not merely because power and war are corrupting forces, but because both began in the aspiration for a political space free of suffering. Snow describes his regime as stable, protective, nurturing. It is in order to promote welfare in the center that those on the margins have to suffer. And when Coin effectively becomes Snow, she presents her argument for a re-inauguration of the Hunger Games as an attempt to avoid wasting life. These are, at least to some extent, utopians, and the suggestion is that utopians in practice kill people. Let me say right now, up front, that I do not think this idea has to lead to complete political paralysis, though it does lead to a relinquishing of political historical hope. philosopher Emmanuel Levinas at one point phrases his argument against hope by telling us that, well, it might be true that we ought to revolt for a society that is other. It must be a revolt that recommences as soon as the other society is established. Always a new revolt against the injustice that is founded as soon as an order is founded. Note that this is a precise description avant la lettre of the situation in the Hunger Games. Note, too, how wearisome the business of revolution suddenly appears when we think that every coin will become a snow. And yet, Levinas does have ideas about positive political possibility. It's just that you can't begin to consider them until you acknowledge the operatic nature of utopia. To speak clearly, you might be able to change a few small things close to you for the better, but only if you are continually aware that the more grand or visionary your aspirations, the more you will be led to sacrifice others to the teleological needs of your ideals, lending support to a dialectic of progress that requires such things as war, violence, and economic depression. We find a similar idea in Theodor Adorno, who tells us that after Auschwitz, even to think hope forsakes hope and works against it. This is a strong critique of hope, but note that one might turn it to something positive if gentle. For the idea that to think hope forsakes hope implies there might be some hope for us as long as we give up hoping. Another way of describing the same dynamic on a smaller scale is via the idea of the happy ending. A while ago in the Wall Street Journal, Megan Cox-Gurdon produced a screed against YA. The characters are all pathological to the point where pathology comes to look normal. Nobody is fixing themselves. We've abandoned the happy ending. Well, to the extent that this is true, this is exactly the way these books are addressing the modern malaise. In the same way that YA readers are politically savvy enough to pick up on the idea that utopia is dystopia, and thus don't want to read about problem-free political alternatives, they also aren't looking to be fed a bunch of false promises about being happy, healthy, and successful. For these promises too cause nothing but suffering. And it's not only because they don't come true, which is obvious, it's because they lead us to waste our lives chasing the future. Levinas, trying to explain how we should rethink religion in the wake of mass death, tells us this. Before the 20th century, all religion begins with the promise. It begins with the happy end. It is the promise of heaven. Well, then, doesn't a phenomenon like Auschwitz invite you, on the contrary, to think ethics independently of the happy end? He actually is a complete revisioning of religion in his thought. One could say the same thing about children's literature. Let me paraphrase. Children's literature begins with the promise. It begins with the happy end. Well, then, doesn't a phenomenon like every supposedly well-intentioned moral and political failure we see around us invite us, on the contrary, to think about ethics independently of the happy end? The problem with the meta-narrative, the grand stories we tell ourselves to give life meaning, here becomes a problem with narrative itself, with any story. And while it's possible we can't get rid of the narrative arc of our stories, which tends to move toward at least a partial sense of accomplishment, we can at any rate ask that our happy ending come with questions. This is why the denouement to Mockingjay works so well. Katniss accepts the idea that politics is an infernal cycle of injustice without even giving it much thought, drops away from society, and isn't spectacularly happy, though she's content enough with being a bit unhappy. It's flat, it's aimless, it defies the idea of resolution and solution. But it's the only ending I can think of that wouldn't just reassert a set of ideals that recuperated themselves into the same Kafkaesque totality. Katniss has truly, passively escaped the system or fallen away from it. And this failure too is Kafkaesque, though in a different sense, a sense that evokes Walter Benjamin's line that there is nothing more memorable than the fervor with which Kafka emphasized his failure. Now, compare Katniss's end to that of Jonas. In The Giver, we do have a promise of a better society at the end. After all Lowry's good work setting up the dystopian manifestation of utopian aspiration, she wipes the slate clean, giving us back not just the status quo, which is clearly better in the world of the community, though it does have its own problems, but the status quo with Christmas, which makes up for every deficiency in the status quo. There is a way to have a bit of utopia without it turning bad, and it's Christianity. But there's no Christmas ex machina in the Hunger Games, and the series is all the more interesting for it. I want now to turn to a couple of other features of the books, both of which support its critique of hope. But first I should probably state for the record that these books are not terribly well written. Someone recently did a textual analysis resulting in a list of the series' oftenest repeated complete sentences, the top 6 of which are, "My name is Katniss Everdeen. I don't know. I shake my head. I am 17 years old. My home is District 12. And now I wish I had." If you haven't read the books, that will give you the flavor of the prose. Note, though, as a complete aside, how much better it is than the prose in the Twilight series, the oftenest repeated 10 sentences in which are, "I sighed, he sighed. I shrugged, I frowned. He chuckled, I laughed. I flinched, I took a deep breath, and he didn't answer." In any case, the writing, as I said, is not fabulous. And in addition, the world building is pretty much incoherent. Starting from the first page of the first book, where we are asked to accept that whereas District 12's electric fence is always without power, and whereas just outside the fence is a forest filled with edible animals, the only people in the district who figured out that hunting might be a viable alternative to starvation are 2 teenagers. Starting there, we are introduced to one improbability after another. None of this stops people from enjoying the books, though, and this is partly because there are other substrates holding the series together and giving it coherence. One of these is a series of classical allusions laid on with a strangely thick brush. To begin with, there's a little bit of biblical residue here. For instance, in the scene with the berries at the end of the first book, we have a harking back to the sacrifice of Isaac. Katniss is acting here as Abraham. She's under the orders of the capital, the divine voice, inside the arena, to kill Peeta, her dependent, her Isaac. And just as she's about to do it, she is stopped by a heavenly voice issuing from the same source as the command to kill. She passes her test, as Abraham presumably passed his, but she passes it as an act of rebellion against her heavenly controller, an interesting take on the biblical text. But enough Bible. The main layer of classical allusion is to the Greeks, for the plot of each book is a retelling of the Theseus myth. In the myth, Athens, having lost a war with Crete, is forced on a regular basis to send to Crete as tribute an equal number of young men and young women who, on their arrival in Crete, are put into a labyrinth and consumed by the Minotaur. But one year, the daughter of the Cretan king Ariadne falls in love with one of the Athenians, Theseus, and gives him a ball of string, which he can lay down as he enters the labyrinth and then use to find his way out if he's successful in killing the Minotaur, which he is. We don't need the rest of the myth to see that each of the Hunger Games books highlights a different aspect of the parallel. The labyrinth of myth is escaped by a young man and a young woman working together. This is what happens in the first Hunger Games book. The labyrinth is mastered with the help of a thread. This is the crux of the second Hunger Games book, where, like Ariadne's thread in the myth, Beatty's wire stretches from the center of the maze, or the heart of darkness, out to the extremity, facilitating its defeat. And finally, the labyrinth is defeated by a joining of forces from the oppressive city and the party representing tribute. Thus, Ariadne becomes Plutarch, Cinna, and the other conspirators from the capital, while Theseus becomes Katniss and the gang. And the 2 sides team up in the 3rd book to bring down the big labyrinth of the regime. Even more interesting than the Greek parallels, though, is the fact that Collins has chosen to set her story in what is essentially Rome. We know the capital is Rome from the character names, from the decadence, from the vomitorium, and centrally from the fact that the capital has called its nation Panem, which is Latin for bread, and has as its main civic ritual a gladiatorial circus, bread and circuses being the Roman watchword for civic peace. Obviously, Collins uses Rome because Rome stands in the Western imagination for empire per se, for the assimilative or homogenizing impulse behind empire and its reliance on economic injustice. Rome stands for the ubiquitous and non-transparent use of political and social power. Rome, in other words, is a good symbol for what I suggested at the beginning of the paper we are all afraid of: surveillance, arbitrary power, homogenization of the system. What is more, the destruction wrought by Rome was enacted in the name of civilizing progress. Rome's purpose was to make the world better, in aid of which they slaughtered and pillaged a lot of people and wiped out a lot of cultures. So we have in the Roman imagery another critique of successful benevolent politics. Being successful isn't necessarily pretty, and benevolent political convictions spread suffering. And Collins is doing something even cleverer by situating her Greek story inside Rome. This provides us a literary representation of empire. The one narrative has colonized the other. The narrative of civilizing oppression has consumed the narrative of simple, hopeful virtue. Okay, so the classical allusions form a substrate which holds things together and gives them a general cast of meaningfulness, while at the same time bolstering the series' appealing paranoia. Another substrate, or at least another ubiquitous motif in the series, is what I want to call trolley problem with a twist. You know, I'm sure, the term trolley problem. Do you switch the trolley from the track where it will kill 4 people to the track where it will kill just 1? Do you push a fat man onto the track, resulting in the derailment of an empty train, but saving the aforementioned 4 people? The trolley problem is just a term for the hypothetical ethical dilemma, and it is the stuff of many introductory philosophy courses where questions like this are used to develop and test broader ethical theories. Now, I will tell you, at the risk of inciting hostility, the people who teach philosophical ethics in the universities are broadly divided into people who like or tolerate trolley problems. These are analytic philosophers, and people who don't like them and wish they didn't have to tolerate them. These are continental philosophers like me. Trolley problems evoke in me something between annoyance and contempt. The problem begins in the fact that the scenarios used couldn't happen. In reality, you could not know from the top of the bridge that the brakes had failed. You could not know that the fat man would land on the track. You couldn't know whether if he landed on the track, he would derail the train. You could not know that his body would be more likely to have the desired effect than your own, etc. Now, of course, many stories, the whole genre of fantasy, rely on things that couldn't happen in reality. But that's why a good fantasy writer has to build up a morality from the ground, one that is plausible in the physical universe she's created. In a world in which trolley problems were physically viable, human beings would have formed a different moral sense. Responsibility, like everything else about our experience, has something to do with physics. But in our world, they aren't physically viable, and therefore they can't tell us anything about ethical theories we might be trying to build. Okay, end of rant. Let's go back to Collins. Novels sometimes center around a single ethical dilemma and its aftermath, but in The Hunger Games, they're a dime a dozen. Should Katniss volunteer for her sister? Should a career volunteer for a stranger? What are the principles governing an in-arena alliance, say between Katniss and Rue? Is Katniss obligated to refrain from killing someone who has refrained from killing her? Should Finnick allow Megs to run back into the poison mist so to allow Finnick to carry Peeta? They come thick and fast, culminating in the 3rd book in one that is quite complex and involves the ethics of warfare. Those who have read the series will know what I mean. And in fact, we hardly need a list, since it's clear that the whole arena is basically a lifeboat exercise. The thing is, though, that Collins continually emphasizes the undecidability of her dilemmas. They are insoluble not merely in the sense that it's not clear what the right choice is, or even in the sense that there is no right choice, but more than this, in the sense that they must not be solved. It is awful, wrong, immoral to make these decisions. And yet, Katniss must decide, and she does. At every moment she decides. This is a Derridian insight, that we must not decide because decision always hurts someone, but that despite this, we must decide, and that ethics therefore involves a continual scandal. In any case, the point is that unlike trolley problems, Collins's moral dilemmas aren't intended to guide us toward a theory. In distinction, they show only that trying to be moral is a tragic business. What's the point? I've got more. Yeah, it's just that with both of these motifs, the Roman eating the Greek and the trolley problems with a twist, Collins is emphasizing, again, hopelessness, political and moral hopelessness. There's no good path, nothing works. Among scholars of children's literature, questions of the virtues and pitfalls of positive political alternatives are most often discussed not under the rubric of utopia. They fall under the rubric of didacticism, since that question too involves the presentation of ideals and our doubts about the virtues of such presentation. For me, the central theorist on this question remains Perry Nodelman, who writes in a recent piece that in encouraging the discovery of what we adults believe the world already is, and in encouraging children to share our world with us, children's literature is positively repressive. But it goes on here and in its other works to argue that this repression has a good side as well as a bad one. I think this is probably true. I think it's probably right, as Nodelman tells us elsewhere, that the fact that children need a children's literature to police them firmly establishes both the policing and the unlikelihood of their ever being permanently policed. As Nodelman shows, children's stories facilitate this endeavor by providing a host of contestatory ideals and shadow texts. But I'd like to add that I think it helps to have books like The Hunger Games in which ideals fail. So let me just repeat that point clearly. The question of didacticism in children's literature operates on very similar turf philosophically to the question of idealism and utopianism in late 20th century political philosophy, since the problem of both is that it's very difficult to do without the presentation of teloi, ends, what Merritt Kopis calls projections of hope. And in both we experience or should experience an ambivalence about those projections. One could theorize this connection at length, but instead I will only say again that the failure of ideals is something children and teens respond to. It doesn't have to be the case that our world is an exact structural parallel of Panem. Ours might indeed, it probably is, a world in which there is no moral and political progress, but it's not, or not quite one, in which every choice we make involves us in some sort of systemic oppression, in which dissent is recuperated back into the machine and all dissenters become oppressors, in which every revolution must be recommenced as soon as the dust is settled. Still, it's close enough to that many of us feel dragged down by the weight of moral decision and the uselessness of political action. And this feeling doesn't necessarily first arise in the teenage years either. Even young children, in my experience, are tired sometimes of being told that they can be anything they want to be, that they should have a dream and follow it, that they can make a better world. They sense the lie behind these slogans and they are ready to hear something different. To their condition, books like The Hunger Games say very simply that it is okay not to dream of a better future. We might not like that, but we can't deny that it's radical. Okay, now I'm coming to the end of the paper, and I need to switch tacks now and take back every single thing I've said. But I'll only do that in like the last sentence. That's the case I would have liked to have made. But I have to end by saying there's a sense in which Collins fails to produce a novel of failure and reverts to the more common understanding, and it involves clothing. We can approach the topic of clothing by looking a bit at the series' presentation of gender. On the male-female front, Collins has done well. It's not just that her hero is female, it's that she's carefully given Katniss a number of stereotypically masculine characteristics and Peeta some feminine ones. She hunts, he cooks. She fights, he's fought over. She's practical, he's artistic. She cares only about herself and her family. He is broadly charitable. That the proto-sexual relation that dominates the series involves Peeta's plaintive cry of "Save me, Katniss," and Katniss's answer of "Grim, I will," is fine, all the more so because this appears natural to the story rather than the stuff of ideological contrivance. Where gender gets more problematic in this series, though, is in the question of the queerness of the capital. Merritt Kopis, the queer theorist I've been citing, is one of several critics who tells us that the capital is coded as queer, and in fact, the point is so obvious to her that she doesn't even bother to support it. I think she's right. It's obvious that the capital's sensuality and licentiousness, their love of outrageous fashion, and their habitual play with their bodily presentation, including gender markers, make it easy for readers consciously or unconsciously to see them as one big decadent drag ball, or perhaps post-punk aesthetic. This, from a queer perspective, is a problem. Yeah? Complicating matters, it's not just the capital that has fashion. The idea that the revolution precedes by fashion is there also. It's there in the movies, but much more in the books, where page after page is spent lovingly describing clothing designs, and where every piece of attire and every accessory, from Katniss's leather jacket through Plutarch Heavensby's watch to President Snow's rose, is to be understood as a political weapon. Cinna, of course, is the central figure here. The supposedly brilliant conception of clothes as weapons is his above anyone else's, And when he's arrested and murdered at a critical moment in the second book, a fashion designer becomes the first martyr of the cause. So, what's happening here? One could read Collins as criticizing the idea that commodities are revolutionary tools. Possibly she is trying to use clothing as the marker of everything that's wrong with the District 13 revolutionaries, everything that allows them eventually to morph into the new capital. Supporting such a reading, there's a rather odd scene in the third book where Katniss finds her stylists imprisoned in District 13 and subsequently reformed as revolutionary image consultants. This claiming of style for the revolution parallels the way District 13 makes use of the capital's panopticon-type surveillance technology and could draw readers to realize that the point ultimately isn't that clothes are good political weapons that can be used by either side, but that clothes are necessarily the weapons of the homogenizing force. A reader should be able to see the rebels are doomed to become the capital from the moment they recruit Cinna. But no reader is going to see it this way, because this is not the way Collins sells it. She really does hold that fashion is a good weapon. That's why she spends the first half of the second book building up Cinna as the series' most sympathetic character, the purest, calmest, and wisest of the rebel leaders. And it's why she shows us Katniss's Mockingjay pin taken up all over Panem as the central symbol of resistance. With Collins' ridiculous suggestion that the revolution is carried and facilitated by a brooch, and that this carrying and facilitating takes place on a grassroots level by the people for the people, she sells us on one of the central lies that sustain our economy, namely that the accessories we use to express our uniqueness are different from commodities, that fashion-inflected rebellion is our own rather than something packaged and sold to us by marketers. The parallel between the capital and the rebels breaks down here, and rather than being left with a critique of the commodity, we're suddenly left with the idea that the capital's weapons might be used against it in a salutary way, that the master's tools can be used to dismantle the master's house, and that one of these tools, perhaps the most effective tool, is the accessory. This might well please a few teenagers and boost merch sales, but it undermines the theoretical thrust that might have been. It's here, too, that I see a potential incipient and, I would guess, unintended criticism of queer culture. For the distinction between the clothes and accessories of the revolutionaries and the clothes and accessories of the capital, with the sole exception of President Snow's rose, is that one set of clothes is being used and the other set is a mark of uselessness. I want to stop talking very soon and cannot build up an analysis of queerness in fashion, not to say that I'm qualified to do that anyway. But if I were to do so, it would involve gay fashion as an embrace of play. The difference between a firefighter in uniform and a gay man at a party in a firefighter's uniform is that the firefighter is going to fight a fire. Well, insofar as the gay man is fighting his own fight, and that's his business whether he is or he isn't, he's fighting it through fun, through frivolity, through non-utility. He does not use the uniform, or he subverts its use. He might be said, in this sense, to be beating a sword into a plowshare. And this is precisely the way you aren't supposed to use clothes in the Hunger Games. This is the way the capital uses clothes. The capital is indeed coded queer because they don't do anything with their clothes. They don't use them as weapons. To me, this brings to light considerations of queer thought that exist mainly in academic discourse and could use a wider hearing, but it does so in a mostly unfortunate way. And with this idea that clothes and accessories should work, an idea that is astonishingly dominant in the series, Collins retracts everything I say she was doing by way of presenting salutary failure and returns us to a normative discourse. Thanks.